Okay, good morning. My name's Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana on a Saturday morning. And we just got our bare root roses in, so this is a quite exciting time for us. We love the change of seasons. Today is kind of the first day of winter, or is it tomorrow? But anyway, we got it. We get in our roses right when winter starts, and we get them as truly bare root roses. So we don't know many nurseries or garden centers that actually offer bare root roses anymore, where they come to us with no soil. These were grown in the Central Valley for, it's about a 2-year crop, and then they plow them out of the ground. About a month ago they started plowing them out of the ground, and then they sent them to us. And we like to sell just grade 1 roses. We can't get grade 1 on every rose every year, but this year apparently we've got grade 1 on all our roses. So grade 1 bare root rose generally means that you've got at least 3 stems. Now this is a grafted rose, so rootstock, they grafted one side of it, and within a 2-year period they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pretty nice stems. Grade 1 means you have at least 3 stems that are pencil thick. And these are all much larger than pencil thick. They're more like finger thick. So real nice 7 stems, grade 1. Now grade 1 doesn't have to be this nice looking. This one, well, this one here is actually got a broken branch, but still would be considered grade 1. And generally, even roses that, so the bare root rose, sometimes the grade 1s we get, here's the, and then the graft is here. Sometimes they'll come in like this, where they have a stem like this with the stem coming off here and a stem coming off here. And that's still considered a grade 1, even if they come off of just one major stem, as long as they come off that stem within 6 inches of where they're grafted. So it's still a grade 1. They can be not as pretty as something that branches off right at the graft area. They can be higher on the stem. Nope. But we like them when they look like this. That's our goal. That's a better, nice vase shape. All the stems going outwards in all directions. Now, just because you get a rose that looks like this doesn't mean that the resulting plant will be perfect. You've got to do some training as you go along, but this really helps to have something that looks like that to start with. Now, this year, compared to the last 2, is much drier. We haven't had an inch of rain yet this rainy season, which started 5 months ago, 3 months ago. Our rainy season started, and no one's really gotten in our area more than an inch yet total. So we're working with a very dry winter, which is fine. I mean, we've had 2 wet years in a row, so we're due for a dry one. But that's a little more challenging. So with the bare root rose, when they plow them out of the ground, it really messes up the root hairs on the rose. And it takes about, anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks in the ground to regain their function. So in the meantime, the top of this rose here, these stems are covered in wax, but they're not totally waterproof. And if we have hot, dry conditions, especially if it gets windy, these will actually shrivel up and not sprout. So we do have to watch it with when we have the cooler winters or the drier winters, that the tops don't dry up. So generally, so some of the things we're doing differently this year is we are trimming these a bit shorter than we have in the past. Now, generally, when you trim a rose back and it's shaped like this, there's buds that you can see on the branches. So on a branch, not the thorns, but they have places where the leaves were attached. So there's a place here, they're called nodes. And that's where the leaves were attached to. I don't know if this camera will pick it up, but this is a node here. This is a node here. Node here. A node here. And wherever a leaf was attached, there is a little, usually it's a pinkish little bud where the branch can start growing from. So when you cut them shorter, it's nice to cut them down to a bud, and the new growth will go the direction where the bud's facing. So if you cut it down, so the new growth from here will go this direction, new growth from here will go this direction. And generally, if your branches are fairly vertical like these, you want the new growth to go toward the outside rather than the inside. I mean, there's no critical rule about that, but in the past, aesthetically, we've wanted the branches to go outwards. So you'd cut it to an outward facing bud. Now on this branch, there's a bud here facing outwards and a bud here. If you're in an area where it gets real windy, cut it to the lower one. So the less stem you have exposed, the less chance of it drying out in the dry air. So here we'll do, so this year we're cutting all the roses back a little shorter than we did the last few years, just because the air is drier this year. We don't want a lot of failure to sprout happening. And, you know, so this is a nice height to start with, but you can go a lot lower than that. You can go down to this bud, this bud, this bud. If you're in a really exposed windy area, it's critical that you don't let the rose dry up. Drying up is going to, you know, can really cause a lot of trouble. It may not kill them, but if these stems dry up, they may not sprout. The plant will then regrow from way down below, and you might get suckers coming out of the roots. So it normally doesn't kill it to dry it up, but it really slows it down. With our weather being so mild here, these will start growing immediately. And you know, if we had weather that was 50 degrees in the daytime and 30 at night, that would stop them from growing. But most winters were 65 to 70 in the daytime and 45 to 50 at night. They will grow. That's spring to them. Now, roses aren't that picky about soil quality. That's one good thing about them, is that the soil doesn't have to be that great. They'll grow in clay if it's not a low bog. So if you've got clay soil, as long as you're not in the lowest part of your garden, they'll be fine with that. Sand, they grow really fast and tall. So the more the soil can breathe, the taller roses get. Be careful though. I replaced the rose bed once with a lot of sand, and my roses grew way too tall. I mean, we had floribundas that were 4 or 5 foot, and hybrid teas that are growing 6 or 7 foot. That wasn't the real look I wanted, but we do understand that the majority of florist roses are grown in sand because they want the longest stems to cut. So if you want long stems, the soil breathes better, more sandy is better. Now, generally, we don't use compost in the ground anymore. If you've seen our other videos, compost does not belong in the root zone of plants. Roses will tolerate it. That won't kill them, but they're better off without compost in the ground. Our potting soils that we create can be used as soil substitutes in the ground. They don't have compost in them. And in containers, certainly, they work well too. And if you are planting them in containers, either one of our potting soils is perfect. You can put them in pure sand, that's fine too, it weighs more. They will grow on most potting soils reluctantly. They won't be as nice looking, but they'll still grow. Again, they're very tolerant of bad dirt. Size the container. A full-grown rose really needs about, well, if you want it to be a good-looking, full-grown hybrid tea rose, which is mostly what we sell, a lot of our customers and a lot of people who grow roses put them in half barrels, which is 20 to 25 gallons of soil. So now the smaller roses, floribundas, miniatures, can go in something smaller than that. But generally you need about 20 to 25 gallons of soil to support a good rose. That's soil a couple feet across. The ground, you're fine. Spacing in a garden, 3 feet has always been what they've told us. So spacing between plants. The further apart you put them, the less disease and bug attacks you'll get. So I was at a garden in Malibu once, and their roses were spaced, on the ocean side of their property, 10 feet apart. And I didn't see any mildew or diseases on them. Of course, if you're on the beach, you've got great earth circulation. So, so an open area, planting them farther apart, you get fewer diseases. Closer you put them together, the more disease can spread. I've made a rose hedge of roses 2 feet apart, and certainly I've done a lot of beds where the roses were real close. So it's you can do what you like. Now, if you have a rose all by itself, it's fine. It rarely gets bugs or diseases. It's when you put roses together in a rose garden is when you get more bugs and diseases. So I've had roses, just singly in a side yard, not good air circulation, no problems, because they're all by themselves. They don't pick up much. So so you can do what you like with the rose spacing. It's not critical, but this is what you'll get: is the further apart they are, the less disease and insect attack you'll probably have. But most people like to grow roses together. They do look good together. So 3 feet is the average spacing between roses. Again, no critical rules on that. Now, if you do have heavy clay soil, again, the faster the drainage, the better the aeration, the faster they'll grow. So if you have clay soil, if you put them in raised beds or mount it up slightly, they'll actually do quite well. But they'll grow in pretty much any soil that we have. Okay, things to look for when you're planting. We don't like to trim the roots too much. I mean, we've seen roses with very few roots do fine. You don't need much root on a rose to get it started. They're dormant, so they're not using a lot of water right now. But it's nice to go through the plants and check for broken roots. You can see this one hanging here. That one's broken. So I'll trim that off.
When you sell your roses, do you trim the roots before you give them to people, or do you?
Well, we try not to. There's a little mic to pick up your voice better. So we try not to do so. Now, there are some rules on that too. So it's nice not to make a fresh cut in the roots or stems close to the ground right before you plant. But that's mainly if you're going into an older rose bed. So what we found is that if we make a fresh wound on a root and install it in an old rose bed immediately, we'll often get those bacterial cankers forming, the big knots, benign tumors that form where soil is in contact with an open wound. Now, we don't worry about it if you're going into a new rose bed, because there are no diseases usually there that'll cause that to happen. But when I've planted roses into an existing rose bed and I had fresh open wounds on the roots and stems, they would often pick up that bacterial canker right where the soil touched the open wound. So you do have to be careful. What I started doing is I made sure if I was going to prune the roots for broken check, prune it the day before, give them at least 1 day to heal over before you put them in the ground. Or if you put them in the ground in an old rose bed, put some clean soil, like our potting soil, right around those roots so they wouldn't be in contact with any soil bacteria. So anyway, we cut cleanly anything that's broken. So that's where a broken branch was attached. Try to make the wounds as small as possible. And then trim them to the height. Again, this year we're wanting to trim a little bit shorter because the air is dry. And now this rose is ready to plant. Now, you can see this rose does not have a basket root. So a lot of the instructions you get, the rose plant ideally has a nice vase-shaped top and a nice basket of roots. And then you put a dirt mound below the basket of roots and then put the roots over it. Well, in reality, that doesn't happen too often. Like this rose root here is going straight down. There's no real basket here. So you just kind of make the hole big enough to get the roots in. This was the original soil level and plant it. You can see where the green stem stops and the brown starts. That was the original soil level. Now this is not critical. We want to cover the roots, so you make it deep enough to cover the roots. But if you want, if you were in Minnesota, you would plant this rose this deep into the ground. And the reason for that, it's grafted right here. You got to protect this graft from freezing. And in Minnesota, it gets so cold that you've got to put them 6 inches into the ground to stop this from freezing. So in the colder parts of the United States, they've always planted bareroot roses, especially grafted roses, deep. And we've always planted them the way they grew them in the Central Valley, which is right here. But back in the 80s, I wanted to see if anything happened to them when you planted them deep. So I planted all my roses deep, like they do in Chicago or Minnesota, and there was no issues. I planted them all this deep, and they rooted through their stems into the soil, and they were fine. There was no long-term problems with planting them deep. except your roots are a little deep, so you might lose some of these roots because they were deeper than they used to be, and roots can't live in the ground more than about a foot. So you might lose a few of the lower roots if you plant them deep. If you want to, you just spread them sideways so they're not so deep. But burying the stems this far doesn't seem to hurt them at all. In fact, if the weather is cool, so if this is your soil in your rose bed, and you've planted your bare root rose the traditional way, which is like this, with the stems coming up like this. So on a year like the last two, we would just make a nice dirt, fill this back in with your native soil, make a nice basin around it, water it real thoroughly, and you're done. Well, this year, if the Santa Anas kick up, especially if they tell us we're going to have Santa Anas, but even if it's just dry and warm, what we would do is get this area nice and wet, and then take the soil from your yard and pile it up like this until you see the sprouts come out the top.
What was that again? What?
Just the mud you made. Pile the mud on the stems to keep them moist. If the air is unusually dry and we have warm days, if we get up around 80 degrees, and especially if the wind blows and get Santa Ana conditions, pile the soil high around the stems until they do start showing new growth. And then you can wash that soil off, or just leave it if you want. It'll slowly wash off on its own. Again, that doesn't really hurt the plant to have it piled up like that. It's very important not to use compost or planter mix or potting soils to do this work. You want just the mud from your garden to do that because it's clean. I, back in when was it? The 80s or early 90s, piled compost up because I didn't have enough dirt. So I put compost up on the stems, which helped hold the moisture in, and they started growing. And then I pulled the compost off. I noticed that the compost had consumed all the lower leaves that were sprouting, because that's the job of compost. Compost is to eat up plant material. It was digesting the leaves that were sprouting inside of it. So don't use compost that's trying to eat the plant. Just pile mud, clay, soil up on those stems to protect them. And again, the alternative is to plant them deep, which doesn't hurt them, since half the country has to do that. So I'll put these back in our bag so they don't dry up here.
I called and I didn't realize I ordered 6. Oh my gosh. I tried to get my husband and my son to help out. They're not workaholics.
Okay, so we send the roses home in a plastic bag like this with water in it. Try to keep them, if you're not going to be planting them immediately, try to keep it in a cool spot, like a shady area outside. Now, we haven't had frost here for a few years. If they say we're going to go below 30 degrees, bring it either underneath the patio roof or inside your garage, because if the roots will freeze since they're not underground. And that really causes trouble with roses. We've had a few years in the past, in the 90s, where we had real bad frost and the roses took way longer to sprout because the roots got frozen. So be careful with that. We don't want to keep them in your house unless you're going to plant them immediately, because you bring them inside, it's average 70 degrees, they're going to start growing real fast. And if they grow inside the plastic bag, there's no air circulation there. Now you can take them out of the bag and put them like this so that the tops are in the air, and that's fine. Moisture down here, they can grow without getting moldy, but if the leaves are forming inside the bag, they tend to get moldy and rot. So, and you can, the other alternative, you can put them in a bucket of water. You can leave them in the bucket of water for months. You're growing them hydroponically, which is fine. Do change the water if the water turns color or starts smelling. You know, change the water frequently. Keep the water clean if you do that. And they can sit in that bucket for a while and then put them in the ground when you have time. But sooner is better. We usually tell people if you have them stored in a cool, shady location, you got about 2 weeks of storage before there's too much leaf growth in the bag. Then get it out of there. Although last year we had someone who couldn't take the roses till February. Now, fortunately, last year was fairly cool, so the leaf growth wasn't too bad. They told us that the roses were the best they'd ever gotten, even though they were sprouting and, you know, having some storage issues in the bag that long. They said they still came out very nice. Of course, if you put them in a pot, it's harder to protect them from dry wind. You can move them around your garden to get them out of the wind. Or you can throw, you know, if it's a real windy day, you can throw a bucket over the top of the plant just temporarily to keep that wind off of them. So it's important to get them to sprout. Hopefully, most of these roses, you'll see new growth within a week or two. If it's taken longer than that, your stems are a bit dry. Pile the dirt on them. That always seems to work. And we've had people bringing roses back to us that were just shriveled like prunes. You can see the wrinkles in the stems, and we just put them in water or underneath a wet blanket. We use a lot of wet blankets here during Beirut season, moving blankets, and just put them on the ground, put the wet blanket over the top, watered them a few times a day, and they would expand back out and start growing. It's really hard to kill on these roses, even if you do let it get really dry. They can recover.
Now you're saying the wet blanket on top, if it's dry, windy?
Well, that's when we get them back from our customers. We won't plant them. We'll just set them on in a shady location, throw the wet blanket on top. But I would imagine if you can put a wet moving blanket over the top of your rose outside on those dry days, it'll work too. But we're here all day, so we can water that blanket 2 or 3 times a day. If you're working, you can't. It's hard to do that. The blanket does dry out. But now in the old days, 20 years ago, they would tell us put green moss over it. Which is so expensive nowadays, we don't usually recommend that anymore. But in the old days, we used green moss on the stems, and you just water the green moss and keep them wet that way. The other method they said, and this was, I believe, the LA Times, they said, well, if you don't have that much dirt, free dirt in your yard, take a newspaper, which some of us still have newspapers at our houses, and roll it up and make a tube out of it and put it over your rose and throw dirt in there. So you don't need as much dirt. You don't have to make a mound. You just throw it in a tube of newspaper over your rose to keep the stems moist until they sprout. So there's different ways you can do that. Just keep everything moist until they start growing. Most other plants that we sell bare root don't have this problem with drying canes. Roses just, they look waxy, but apparently they don't have as much, they're not as waterproof as, like when we sell bare root apple trees and peach trees, we never think about that. And they always seem to wake up without drying out, even if the weather is very dry and windy. Okay, so once they get in the ground, you got them all set. Once they sprout, Now, usually once they sprout, you throw the fertilizer down on the ground. There's a lot of choices there. So in a pot at the nursery, we always use Osmocote, just because if in containers, the fertilizers kind of flush through the soil very quickly, and you have to do them at least once a month in a pot of potting soil. In the ground, that doesn't usually happen. If you fertilize them once good in the ground, that should last 2 or 3 months at least. The Osmocote is a time-release granule that lasts up to 6 months, so that's what we use, just because we don't want to have to go and hand fertilize the rose plant every month to keep it going. Again, in the ground, you don't have to worry about it as much. The ground retains the fertilizer better. And you have a lot of choices. You can use an all-purpose fertilizer. These say rose on them, but it can be almost any kind of fertilizer will help get them going. Now, the plant doesn't die if you don't feed it. It just grows slower, much slower, doesn't grow as fast. The leaves aren't as dark, but it's not dying. It won't die if you don't feed it. It just won't grow very much. So generally, they're well fed before you get them. If you put them in, you forget to feed them, they'll grow about a foot in bloom. And then after that, they'll be real stunted because they've got enough fertilizer to get one set of flowers out, and then that's about it. Okay, so typically we'll get attacks by bugs and diseases on roses. So if you don't treat it, they don't die. So rarely do roses die from diseases or insects. They just don't look good. At my own house, I've got 3 fairly old roses in my backyard, and generally I don't treat them at all. So in the springtime, when the new growth starts, they'll get some aphids on them. I just say, well, as long as you're gone by the time they bloom, I won't worry about it. And they'll get some diseases, but I do have my roses well spaced. They're about 6 foot apart, so they don't seem to get much disease on them. So we really don't do much spraying at all on them. But here at the store, when we grow roses here, they're less than a foot apart. So we generally grow about 400, 500 roses in the number 5 containers, which are 10 inches wide and 12 inches deep. And we'll put them all close together because we don't have room. And they will pick up diseases and bugs. So now in the nursery, we have to be really wary of catching certain diseases. Now, at your home, it's not that important. You're not growing roses to make a living. At the nursery, we can't afford to lose our plants or even to have them take more time to get ready to sell. So we do use the regular sprays to accomplish that. So there are some diseases that happen when they're that close together, no air circulation, that you won't get at your house. So we use the regular products like Garden Foss and Fungimax pretty regularly when we're starting our roses. Fungimax is a product that'll stop rust and black spot and mildew fairly well. The Garden Foss stops downy, which is a disease that you probably never see at your homes. It's when the roses are real close together and it's cold and wet and rainy. I've never seen this in a homeowner setting at all, the downy disease. So these are not that important for homeowners, but for us at the nursery, these are 2 of the top fungicides that nurseries use.
I forget what you call, what's the yellow stuff that goes under the leaves?
Rust. Rose rust.
Like a powder.
Right. This will stop the rust.
It's a fungi.
It's a fungus.
A fungus, yeah.
Yeah, it's a rust fungus,
Oh yeah, rust.
which is not deadly to the plant. It's a leaf disease only, but it's not pleasant to get it.
I keep taking them off. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay.
Now, for most of the year, after the rainy season's over and after we get the roses on display, we've pretty much only used 2 items, and they're both organic. So we use spinosad and All Seasons mineral oil. In some references, they've said you can use canola oil, even olive oil instead of mineral oil. I'm not sure which is cheaper. Canola probably is cheaper. I haven't used that one, but there are recipes on the internet for using that instead. So the reason we use both of these, the All Seasons oil does a decent job killing aphids and other little bugs, especially spider mice. Does a good job in that. But it is our main mildew control. So oils tend to kill off powdery mildew very well. So we use this. Now we add the baking soda to it too. So on these 2 products, I'll just write this down. So the mineral oil, the range on the label is 2 to 5 tablespoons per gallon of water. We generally have always used 4. So this is 1 gallon of water. 4 tablespoons of mineral oil, and baking soda we add to it. One tablespoon. The oil sticks to the rose really well. We don't add any wetting agents. The baking soda, we mix them together with the oil and the water and spray it on. And this has done the best job with powdery mildew on the rose that we've ever seen, and better than the regular chemicals. Now, a lot of these chemicals are really good when they first come on the market, but as they age, as they're on the market, like this has been on the market for probably 25 years. So it's not as good against mildew as it was 25 years ago. Most diseases evolve over time. But we've been doing this baking soda oil since the 80s, and it's never seemed to be able to become immune to that combination, oil and baking soda. Mm-hmm.
The mineral oil and baking soda, can you add spinosad to that, or does that have to be a separate spray?
Well, we do it at a separate time for a couple reasons. Oils, sometimes when you combine them with other chemicals, they burn easier. So we haven't tried it together before, but also we alternate here at the nursery. So we use the mineral oil and baking soda 1 week. Now this is our main spray from about mid-April through summer at the nursery until we get the roses sold. So we do this, say, week 1. And then the next week, we'll do spinosad. And for roses, we usually recommend the spinosad soap. Here at the nursery, we use a commercial version of spinosad and then combine it with a commercial wetting agent to make it stick. Unfortunately, the commercial wetting agent just comes in gallon size, and most homeowners wouldn't want to buy a gallon of wetting agent. That'll last you a couple lifetimes. But the wetting agent that we can get messes the roses up. I don't know, they don't make it properly so that it causes some foliage, weird growth. Let's put it that way. It makes the roses grow not real pretty. So here, this has got the soap. The soap is a wetting agent. This doesn't seem to cause any trouble on the rose growth. So we sell the spinosad soap. It does come in concentrate. And we do this to stop. So will control a lot of little bugs and mildew really well. This one stops thrips. So thrips have become the major pest on roses. Now there's 2 thrips we get on roses. The one thrip starts around March, April when it gets warm. Every year it gets warm at a different time. And it's the western flower thrip. It only affects the petals of the rose. So it's not that bad. What happens, the western flower thrips, they don't like red roses. They like the light colored roses. The adult thrip comes, lays eggs into the flower bud as it opens, and the babies suck on the outer petals. So the outer petals of your roses are all brown.
Yes.
And that happens March, April, May. You spray them every other week with the spinosad. That stops them. Or if it's real bad, you can spray them 2 weeks in a row. But the spinosad is the best product we've seen against thrips. The oil has some effect, but not a whole lot. So the western flower thrips attacks us in the spring and cool weather. But there's another thrip, the chili thrip. That comes in summer, or generally it's hot weather. Now, fortunately, the last 2 years haven't been that hot. 3 years ago, we were 80 degrees in February and we hit 100 in April, and the chili thrip showed up in July, even in June. And what they do is they go after the whole plant. They like new growth. The new growth coming out of the plant is just shrivels up, just turns brown. Can't get any flowers. We've had a few customers say my rose plants are dying, and they pull them out and throw them away. They don't realize that it's not killing them, but all the new growth is just getting sucked. So here in Orange County, the average time we see them is late August, September, when it finally gets really hot for a while. It can happen earlier. Now we're lucky we're not Texas, Louisiana, Florida. They have to deal with the chili thrips from May or June. Real nasty down there. Chili thrips they originated in India. They got to the U.S. about 10 years ago. So, or maybe 12 years ago now. We've been dealing with them here about 7, 8 years. Yes.
Do the chili thrips infect anything else other than roses?
Anything with new growth can get hit. So they call them chili thrips because the growth on a chili plant during the summertime just shrivels up. But they said they can attack over 200 variety species of plants. So anything with new growth during warm weather can get hit by them. The roses, but just about anything. If you see shriveled up new growth or warped new foliage in the summer and fall, that's chili thrips. Spinosad will control according to the research, 95% of the population gets killed off. Unfortunately, it doesn't kill 100% of them. That's why we also then do the oil the next week. Hopefully the oil gets the 5% that this didn't. And it's worked for the last 3 or 4 years. This combination's worked really well for us. We don't see any chili thrip evidence at our store. And they're both considered organic. The baking soda, the reason we've had that is that this stops disease spores from germinating or sprouting, sporulation, for half a week to a week. So if you have, rose diseases are universal. They've just float in the atmosphere. So when they land on your rose in a drop of water, this slows them down from attacking the plant. This may not work against rust and black spot and downy disease, but the main problem we do have around here is mildew. Mildew likes the weather that humans like. Dry, not raining, but humid, not dry. And the temperature range is 55 to 85, which is what we like. 55 to 85 degrees during the day, night and day. That's powdery mildew weather. It's usually mid-April through first part of July, and then once we get warmer than 85 in the daytime, the powdery mildew doesn't like it. Of course, this last year and the last 2 years, we've had to fight mildew almost the entire summer. Again, if your roses are have good air circulation, like if you have a rose on the street, if you have one of those parking strip planters, you put them out there, because I had one at my first house. I had the roses out there, never got mildew. Every time a car would run by, they get a breeze, and that kind of stopped them. But what happened at my house, within 10 feet of my house wall, all those roses would get mildew because the house blocks the air circulation. But you get out 10 feet from the house wall, no more mildew. It was crazy. Anything within 5 feet of the house, terrible mildew. But got out 10 foot away. I had streets on 3 sides, so good air circulation unless you got close to the house. It's kind of sad now. One of the reasons the roses aren't as popular as used to be is that back in the 80s, we did not have black spot. We did not have downy. Those 2 diseases were not in California. And they made it in the 90s, and then that's when we had to start using some of these stronger materials to keep the roses clean. I will mention, if you don't like aphids, this product here, and there are products similar to this on the market. This is Dr. Earth. They have 6 different essential oils in here, all pantry grade material. So culinary oils, and the mixture of 6 different ones seems to kill aphids a little better than one oil. So if you're having problems, if you don't like aphids and you don't like the way they look, even though they usually disappear as the first flower buds open, this works a little better than this. If you can't stand the aphids at all and this is not doing it good enough for you, you have to go to something that's not organic, like the Rose Shield. That pretty much takes care of any disease and insect, but it's not organic. In the past, we had other tools, but this year the EPA in the state of California, or the state of California, has banned one of the other pesticides that we've been using on roses. So, in other words, in the past, we had a systemic product. You just poured it on the ground or placed the granules on the ground, and you didn't have any bugs or diseases for a month or so. Those have been taken off the market. Okay. Yes.
We're talking about all this disease. My comadre, my friend, she likes to eat the rose petals. Now, can she eat? I don't use much of this, but can she still come to my garden and say, "Oh, I'm going to take a petal and eat it," and not affect her?
Well, these products are used in vegetable gardens. And like this one says, wait 1 day before you eat them. For most of the vegetables, you spray it on. This one has no waiting time because it's something we eat. And this one just evaporates and it's gone within a few hours. So now I don't know if roses are good for her, but they're
I
not.
don't need them, but I do pick them and share with the neighbors.
But I mean, generally what they tell us is that if a plant's got thorns on it, it's probably non-toxic. Anything with thorns tends to be non-toxic because the plant uses the thorns as its protection. Any plant that doesn't have thorns, be careful, because it's probably going to eliminate its predators with chemicals in it. So that's one rule, but doesn't always hold true, but that is one rule in nature. If it's got thorns, it's probably non-toxic.
That's good. What about, this is not about roses, but plants with sap, the white sap, that's not.
No, okay, the question was, do plants with white sap, are they all toxic? No, but be careful. So the euphorbia family, most of the plants that are in the euphorbia family have milky white sap, and most of the plants in the euphorbia family are considered poisonous, but poinsettias have milky white sap, and they are euphorbia, and they're considered non-toxic. And there's a plant called a milk bush that they claim is non-toxic, even though you poke it and all the white sap comes out. So, well, that's toxic.
Everybody has those now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so the last thing we'll mention to you, so these roses came to us without leaves. Now, if you have a rose garden this time of year, your roses are still blooming.
Yes.
And so growing. I do not like to prune my roses back in the winter like most textbooks have told us to. Generally, if you're any place north of, say, Tennessee or California, you're pruning them after the snow melts, which is usually March or April. And we've seen questions in journals where they ask, why do people in California prune their roses in the middle of winter? Why don't they prune them in spring like the rest of the country does? So back in the 80s, I started pruning my roses back. And you don't have to prune roses back, but in the northern parts of the country, there's so much damage done by the winter that they have to clean up the dead stuff and the severely diseased stuff, half frozen things, and cut them off. We don't have to do that here, although we get a rainy season, which does cause a lot of rust and black spot, which, our rainy season is December through March. And your leaves are full of diseases at that point. So I decided, well, let's just prune them back in the spring when the rain stops. And I've done that now since the 1980s at my own house. And then you don't have to worry about the rain-caused diseases. So you just let it happen and then clean it up at the end of winter. And you won't have to deal with those. You just have to deal with mildew, which doesn't like rain, and bug problems. Yes.
Cutting back, does that encourage new growth?
Well, the reason we cut roses back in the wintertime or in the spring is to renew the wood. I mean, it's not essential. The rose plant doesn't really want you to do this work. But what we know, and what we've learned over the years, is that in the U.S. we like roses to have this nice spiral center. What we found out, like in Europe, in England especially, they like a lot of roses that have more petals on them. Let me get a picture of an English type rose out. Like this one here. They don't have that spiral in the center. And what we learned over the years, like the famous English rose company, David Austin Roses, they tell you don't touch our roses for 3 years. We want the stems to get thick, covered with bark. The reason for that is the thicker the stems are, the more petals the flower has. When you get too many petals on a rose that's supposed to look like this, they lose their center. They start looking a lot like English roses. We saw that when they did that at the Huntington Gardens back in the 80s and 90s. They had a curator there that was working on the roses. He wanted to leave them this high in the winter. So I went there one spring to look at the roses, because they claim they're getting a lot more roses the first bloom of the year than when you cut them short. But I went over there and looked at them, and I go, the sign says double delight. It does not look anything like double delight. Too many petals. All the roses look like English roses. So we want the nice spiral in the center with 30, 40 petals, not 100 petals on them. And to do that, you cut them down you want them to be on new wood. So you eliminate as much of the old branches as you can, not too much. And we usually cut them down to, well, it depends what rose garden you are. So I was at Rose Hills in Whittier. They cut the roses down to almost ankle height, because they don't want any old looking stems on their roses. All this new growth comes out, green stems, got the nice spirals. So the lower you cut your roses, the more you'll end up with the spiral flowers. The higher you leave them, they get more petals. If the stems are older, they seem to get more petals on the flowers. So it just depends. Like a lot of the Floribunda roses that are not used for cutting, that we like a lot of little petals on them, we don't cut them back as far. You can leave them like 2 or 3 foot tall, and you'll get more petals and more flowers on those roses. But the hybrid teas, where you want single flowers on long stems, we cut those shorter, and it forces them to make new stems, long new stems with big spiral blooms on them. So florist roses are cut shorter, more severely, so that you don't build up the old wood. So that's your goals on roses. I mean, you don't have to do it that way. You can do your roses any way you like. If they come out the way you like, you look any way you like. I mean, they used to have all these textbooks and pamphlets on how to prune roses properly, but like in the public rose gardens, they're not getting as much help to prune the roses as they used to. And the people who take care of those gardens don't want to spend that much time on them. So now they have little pamphlets on how to prune roses with chainsaws, so that they get done in a few hours rather than a few weeks. To public rose garden with thousands of roses in it, they can't afford to take that much time anymore. So chainsaws, they said, you have to go from the bottom up and in to avoid really messing up the branches.
Is there a difference between a bush and a climber when you prune?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. So most climbers bloom best on old wood to an extent. So usually the climbers, you leave the same stems there in the winter and spring or all year for at least 4 or 5 years. You just leave those stems on there, and then as they get really old, they may not bloom as well. Cut them off, but leave them full length, which in the case of most climbers is 7 to 12 foot long, depending on the climber. But leave the stems full length, you get better flowering until they get really old.
Because I have one that was really blooming and blooming and blooming, and now nada, nothing. Why? Shouldn't it? Because the other roses are. Every rose has its own personality. Yeah. I mean, when it wants to bloom, or if it wants to bloom a lot or not.
Yeah, I mean, some roses bloom best on new wood, some roses bloom best on old wood. You have to kind of figure out the plant. Yeah, it's just experience. Go with
It's my tropical lighting. It's a beautiful thing. It's
Hmm.
incredible. But now, where are you? Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
Is it too early to prune roses?
No, but I like to prune them late. I mean, we just talked about that. Because if you prune them now, you get a lot of new growth. They get exposed to the worst weather of our year, which is the rainy season. If you prune them in April, then you can clean them up just one time with to get all the diseased leaves off, the rust, the black spot leaves, and it doesn't usually rain after April, and then you're clean the rest of the year. But if you prune them now, I mean, you're not going to kill them or anything, or there's no permanent. Well, if you get black spot on new growth and you've cut them back hard, you've got to cut off the wood that's infected with the black spot, which can leave you with a really small plant. They say, if you're like in New York, they'll get rain in the summer and they're cutting off the diseased wood, and sometimes they come up with rose plants that are less than a foot tall because they have to get rid of the diseased wood on black spot. Black spot discolors the stems red and black and all that. They have to get that off the plant, and sometimes, if the plant's real small, there's not much left. So we like, the way I like to tell people now is leave your roses big in the winter time when it's raining, and then trim them back in the spring
I didn't
when it's
realize
dry.
rain affected the roses that much.
Well, rust and black spot.
Yeah, and I have them both. Yeah.
Yeah, they both need wet leaves. Now, mildew is different. Mildew doesn't like water moving, so they hate it when it rains. So mildew attacks us during the dry season. Mildew still needs some dew droplets to start, but they don't like moving water. So,
Because that's affecting my orchids.
okay, all right,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.